Story 1.
I remember that Christmas Eve like it was yesterday, though it's been nigh on 20 years now, and the memory still sits heavy in my chest, like a stone I can't cough up. We lived in a little hollow deep in West Virginia, the kind of place where the mountains fold in on themselves, trapping the cold and the quiet until it feels like the world's forgotten you exist. The snow had started falling that afternoon, thick and relentless, blanketing the pines in a hush that muffled every sound. The crunch of boots on the path, the distant call of a crow, even the wind whispering through the branches. It was too quiet, too watchful, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to stir. Our cabin was old, built by my grandpa back when coal was king, with walls that creaked in the winter gales and a tin roof that pinged under the weight of the flakes. Maud spent the day baking, the smell of cinnamon and cloves filling the air, mixing with the sharp tang of pine from the tree we dragged in from the woods. Pa was out chopping extra wood, his axe thunking steadily against the logs, while my little sister Ellie played with her doll by the hearth, humming carols in that off-key way kids do. We were set to head to the old church for midnight mass, a tradition as solid as the hills themselves. The church was a weathered thing, wooden beams worn smooth by generations of hands, the preacher's voice echoing like thunder in a barrel. It was the one night a year when the scattered families from the hollows came together, sharing warmth and hymns against the dark. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, turning the sky a bruised purple, we started bundling up, scarves wound tight, boots laced against the deepening snow. That's when the knock came, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the cozy hum of our preparations. Puff rose with his coat half on, glancing at Ma with a furrowed brow. Folks didn't just show up unannounced in weather like this. The roads were treacherous, slick with ice hidden under the powder. I opened the door, letting in a gust that carried the bite of frozen earth, and there stood a man I hadn't seen in years, if I'd seen him at all. He called himself Jeb, my cousin from down south, though the family ties were murky at best, some branch of kin that branched off long ago. His eyes were hollow, shadowed like he'd been driving through the night without a wink of sleep, and his cheeks were gaunt, pulled tight over bones that seemed too sharp. Snow clung to his shoulders, melting into dark patches on a coat that looked threadbare, smelling of damp earth and something metallic I couldn't quite place, like rusted nails or old blood. "Merry Christmas, kin," he said, his voice gravelly, with a smile that didn't reach those eyes. "Heard you all were gathering for Mass. Figured I'd join if you'll have me." We let him in, of course, family's family, especially on Christmas, and turning away blood on a holy night felt like tempting fate. Ma fussed over him, pouring hot coffee into a mug, while Pod clapped him on the back, asking after folks we barely remembered. Jeb settled by the fire, his boots leaving wet prints on the floorboards, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. But as he warmed up, little things started nagging at me. His hands, for one, they were callous sure enough, but the nails were caked with dirt, like he'd been digging, and when he gripped the mug, his knuckles whitened unnaturally. Ellie stared at him from across the room, her doll forgotten, eyes wide as if she sensed something off too. He spun a tale about coming from Alabama, where the winters were milder, but the details shifted like smoke. First it was a job in the mills that brought him north. Then it was visiting an aunt who'd passed. I chalked it up to road weariness, but that metallic scent lingered, growing stronger as the fire crackled. We talked as the clock ticked toward 11, the snow outside piling higher against the windows, turning the world into a white void. Jeb asked after the family, his questions probing in a way that felt too familiar, like he already knew the answers. He mentioned Uncle Harlan, who died in a mining accident when I was a boy, asking if we'd ever found his watch in the rubble. Pa's face went pale. That watch had been buried with him, a detail never shared outside our kin. But Jed just smiled, sipping his coffee, saying he'd heard it from someone down the line. The fire in the hearth flickered then, not the steady dance of flames, but something erratic, like it was breathing, in and out, casting shadows that twisted into shapes no flame should make, elongated figures that seemed to reach across the walls. I blinked, and they were gone, but the chill in the room deepened, seeping through my sweater despite the heat. Ma tried to lighten things, talking about the gifts under the tree, but Jeb's gaze kept drifting to the photos on the mantel. Old black and whites of grandparents long gone, his lips moving silently, as if reciting names. By the time we stepped out into the night, the snow had slowed to a gentle drift, but the air was biting, stinging my face like needles. The path to the church was a narrow trail through the woods, lanterns swinging in our hands to light the way. Jeb walked beside me, his footsteps crunching softer than they should, almost muffled. The pines loomed overhead, branches heavy with snow, and every so often, a clump would fall with a soft thud, making Ellie jump. "Beautiful night," Jeb murmured, his breath not fogging the air like ours did. I nodded, but unease gnawed at me. The forest felt alive, watchful, eyes in the dark that I couldn't see. We reached the church, its steeple poking through the trees like a finger pointing to heaven, warm light spilling from the windows onto the snow. Inside, the congregation was sparse, folks from neighboring hollows huddled in pews, the air thick with the scent of wet wool and candle wax. The preacher, old Reverend Mills, stood at the pulpit, his voice booming the opening hymn. "O come all ye faithful," the words echoing off the rafters. We slid into a pew near the back, Jed between me and Pa, his presence a solid weight that pressed too close. As the service went on, readings from Luke about the birth in a manger, I felt him lean in, his shoulder brushing mine. The candles flickered, much like our hearth had, shadows playing tricks on the walls, faces in the grain of the wood that seemed to stare. Jeb started whispering then, low and insistent, words meant only for me. "Your pa's got sins, boy," he said, his voice like rustling leaves. "That night in the woods with Aunt Clara, ain't nobody knows but me and the trees." My blood ran cold. Pa's old affair was a secret buried deeper than the coal seams, something Ma had forgiven in silence years ago. No one living should know, least of all a distant cousin. I glanced at Pa, but he was focused on the preacher, oblivious. The congregation shifted uneasily around us, folks rubbing their arms as if a draft had slipped in, though the doors were shut tight. Mrs. Harlan from down the road kept glancing back, her face pinched, like she felt that unnatural chill seeping through the pews, wrapping around ankles and creeping up spines. The whispers didn't stop. Jeb talked of other things, my own boyhood mischief, stealing from the general store and hiding the goods in the creek bed. Ellie's nightmares about the man in the woods, which she'd only ever confided in me. His breath was cold against my ear, carrying that metallic tang, and each word pulled at something inside me, unraveling threads I'd long forgotten. The hymn swelled, "Silent Night," but the harmony felt off, voices faltering as if an unseen weight pressed on throats. Reverend Mills paused once, mopping his brow, eyes darting to our pew before continuing. I wanted to bolt, to drag my family out into the snow, but Christmas Mass was sacred. Leaving would invite whispers of its own. Jeb just sat there smiling, that hollow grin, his hands folded in his lap, nails still dark with earth. Finally, the service ended with a benediction, folks murmuring Merry Christmas as they filed out, lanterns bobbing back into the night. We trudged home, the path now deeper with snow, our breaths puffing like smoke signals. Jeb walked ahead, his silhouette blending with the trees, and for a moment I swore he flickered, like a shadow detaching from the trunk. Back at the cabin, Ma stoked the fire while Pop would nod, but the warmth wouldn't take hold. Jeb declined to bed, saying he'd rest by the hearth, and we retired upstairs, the stairs creaking under our weight. Sleep came fitful, dreams haunted by whispers and shapes in the dark. Come morning, Christmas Day, the sun filtered through frosted windows, casting a pale glow. Ellie rushed down for gifts, her laughter a brief spark against the lingering cold. But Jeb was gone, no coat on the hook, no boots by the door. We searched the cabin, calling his name, but only silence answered. That's when I saw the footprints, leading from our porch, crisp in the fresh snow. They trailed off into the woods, straight toward the thicket, where the trees grew dense and wild. But they didn't stop at the edge. They went deeper, farther than any man could walk in that powder without snowshoes, vanishing into the underbrush where the feral folks were said to roam, those lost souls who'd gone wild in the hills, surviving on what the forest gave. eyes gone mad from isolation. We followed them a ways, Pa muttering about checking on him, but the trail just petered out, like he dissolved into the air. No body, no sign, just those prints ending abrupt in a clearing ringed by ancient oaks. That was the last we saw of Jeb, if he was Jeb at all. The gifts were unwrapped under the tree. Ellie's dollhouse, my new knife. But the joy was tainted, a shadow hanging over the day. We've never spoken of it much, chucking it to a drifter or a fever dream, but I've locked the doors every Christmas since, double-checking the latches as the snow falls. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the holler, rattling the panes like impatient fingers, I swear I hear his knock again, patient and insistent, echoing from the woods where the footprints led. And in those moments, I wonder if he's out there still, waiting to whisper more secrets, pulling at the roots of our family tree until it all comes tumbling down. The mountains keep their own counsel, you see, and some kid ain't meant to come home.
Story 2.
It was a bitter Christmas in the Smoky Mountains, the kind that clamps down on you like a vice, with the roads ice over slick as glass, and you're cut off from the world for days, maybe weeks if the plows don't make it through. Our cabin sat tucked into a fold of the hills, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the endless stretch of pines and ridges to keep us company. The snow had been falling steady since dawn, fat flakes piling up against the windows, muffling the outside world, until all you could hear was the creak of the timbers settling under the weight, like the house itself was sighing from the cold. Ma had been baking all morning, the oven pumping out heat, and the smell of gingerbread that fought against the chill seeping through the cracks. Pa was gone, had been for years, taken by the lung sickness from the mines, but we'd made do. Just me, Ma, and my sister Lena, who was quieter these days, her laugh not as bright since the accident a few summers back. We didn't talk about that much. It was one of those buried things, like so many in these mountains, where folks learned early to let the past lie quiet, lest it stir up trouble. Ma had mentioned inviting Ken over the week before, some distant relative on her side we'd never met. Family's important, especially at Christmas, she'd said, her voice firm, but with that edge of loneliness that crept in during the holidays. I'd nodded, not thinking much of it. Folks in the hollows claimed kinships that stretched thin as spider silk, half-forgotten branches of the family tree twisted by time and feuds. The power lines hummed faintly outside, but with the storm building, we knew the lights might not hold. I was chopping wood out back when I first saw him, a figure emerging from the tree line, like he'd been spit out by the forest itself. He trudged through the snow on foot, no vehicle in sight, his coat dusted white and hanging heavy on a frame that looked worn down by more than just the walk. In his hand, he carried nothing but a worn Bible, leather cracked and faded, looking older than the hills around us, like it had been passed through generations of hard living. Ma opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been expecting him. "Elias," she said, her face lighting up in that polite way, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He nodded, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, his breath not fogging the air quite like it should, and the biting cold. "That's me, ma'am. Kin through your Aunt Ruth's line, down from Knoxville way." His voice was low, gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. We welcomed him in, of course. Hospitality runs deep in these parts, and turning away a stranger in a blizzard felt like bad luck, especially on Christmas Eve. I took his coat, heavy with damp, and hung it by the stove to dry. Up close, he was older than I'd thought, face lined with creases that spoke of hard years, eyes a pale blue that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Ma poured him hot cider, steam rising in curls, and he settled into Pa's old chair by the fire, the Bible resting on his knee like a talisman. Right away, something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was in the way his gaze lingered too long on the family photos lining the mantel, faded pictures of Pa in his mining gear, Lena and me as kids playing by the creek, Ma young and smiling at some long-ago picnic. He stared like he was memorizing faces, committing them to some inner ledger, his fingers tracing the edge of the Bible absent-mindedly. Lena hovered in the doorway, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater, eyes darting to him and away. She hadn't been the same since that day by the river, when she'd slipped on the rocks and hit her head, coming back different, quieter, with headaches that made her wince at loud noises. We'd told folks it was just a bump, nothing more, but there were whispers in town about how she'd been alone too long before we found her, how the water had pulled at her like it wanted to keep her. Elias sipped his cider slow, the mug not steaming as much as ours, and thanked Ma with a nod. "Fine place you got here," he said. "Reminds me of the old homesteads, back when the mountains kept their secrets better." As the afternoon wore on, we set about decorating the tree, a scraggly pine I'd cut from the edge of the woods, its branches sagging under strings of popcorn and tinsel. The radio crackled with carols. "Oh, Holy Night," fighting through the stat. But the storm was picking up, wind whistling through the eaves like distant voices calling. Elias joined in, his hand steady as he hung ornaments, but he started murmuring stories from the old days, tales that crept in quiet and settled like frost. He spoke of feuds between kin that echoed down the generations, brothers turning on brothers over land disputes, disappearances in the fog-shrouded hollows where folks went missing and weren't found till spring thaw, if ever. His words mirrored our own buried history too closely for comfort. He mentioned a great uncle who'd vanished during a hunt, body never recovered, just like Grandpa Illis, whose rifle we'd found leaning against a tree untouched. Ma paused with a string of lights in her hand, her smile faltering. "How'd you know about that?" she asked, voice light but probing. Elias just shrugged, that pale gaze flicking to the window where snow swirled. "Stories travel, ma'am. Kin remember." The unease grew as daylight faded, the cabin's isolation pressing in. Outside, the world was a white blur, the road buried under drifts that would trap us till the melt. Inside, the fire popped and hissed, but the warmth didn't chase the chill that seemed to emanate from Elias himself. Lena retreated to her room early, claiming a headache, her footsteps soft on the stairs. I busied myself with supper, venison stew simmering on the stove, the savory smell mixing with the pine, but I caught Elias watching me, his expression unreadable. As we ate, the conversation turned to family lore, and he wove in details that hid like stones in still water. The fire that took the old barn when Ma was a girl, the way it started mysterious in the night, the cousin who drowned in the creek, pulled under by currents stronger than they should be. These weren't tales we'd shared. They were the quiet shames, the things whispered behind closed doors. Ma laughed it off, but her knuckles whitened on her spoon, and I felt him not tightening my gut. Night fell hard, the storm raging now, wind battering the cabin like it wanted in. The power flickered, lights dimming and surging, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. We gathered by the tree, its lights twinkling fitfully, trying to salvage some holiday cheer with stories and songs. But Elias's presence loomed, his Bible open now in his lap, pages yellowed and thin. He read a passage from Isaiah, his voice steady, but the words felt twisted in the air, heavy with something unspoken. The house grew quieter then, unnaturally so, the creaks of the settling timbers fading, the wind's howl muting as if a blanket had been thrown over the world. Ornaments on the trees swayed without a breeze, glass baubles clinking softly against needles, their reflections distorting in the firelight. I caught glimpses of shadows in the corners that didn't belong, dark shapes that pooled like spilled ink, shifting when I wasn't looking directly. It was later, when Ma had gone to check on Lena, that Elias cornered me in the kitchen. I'd stepped away to fetch more wood from the back porch, the cold blasting in as I opened the door, snow eddying across the floor. He followed silent, his footsteps barely audible, and when I turned, he was there, closer than he should be, his breath cold against my ear despite the steam from the kettle. "That accident with your sister," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "Wasn't no slip, was it? She went in after something, voices in the water, calling her name. You pulled her out, but part of her stayed down there, didn't it? Secrets like that don't stay buried forever." My heart hammered, blood rushing in my ears. We'd sworn to keep it secret. Lena had been sleepwalking, drawn to the river by nightmares of drowned kin. Legends of the mountains pull on weak souls. No one knew but us. We told the doctor it was just a fall. Elias's eyes bored into mine, that Bible clutched in his hand, and for a moment, the kitchen spun, shadows lengthening as the lights flickered again. I backed away, muttering something about needing air, but the dread clung like damp clothes. The rest of the evening blurred, returning with forced cheer, Elias closing his Bible with a snap that echoed too loud. We retired early, the storm lashing the windows, but sleep evaded me. Lying in bed, I listened to the silence that had overtaken the house, broken only by faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, words I couldn't make out, but that pulled at memories I'd long pushed down. Dreams came fragmented. Lena by the river, her hand reaching into the depths, Eliza's face morphing into Grandpa's, eyes hollow as mine shafts, the forest closing in, branches like fingers grasping. Come dawn, the storm had broken, weak sun filtering through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the snowbound world. I rose stiff, the cabin cold despite the bank fire. Ma was already up, poking at the embers, but Elias was gone. No coat on the hook, no boots by the door. We called for him, searching the rooms, but there was no sign, as if he'd melted away with the night. On the table by the tree sat his Bible, open to a page from Revelations, words speaking of judgment and secrets revealed. And there, marking the spot, faded bloodstains bloomed across the paper, brown and old, like they'd been there for decades. Ma gasped, hand to her mouth, and I felt a chill deeper than the winter air. We burned it that afternoon in the stove, pages curling black, the smoke acrid and thick, carrying up the chimney into the sky. But that wasn't the end. The whispers echo in my dream still, pulling at threads I thought were long forgotten. Lena's accident replaying, the feud stirring like unrest ghosts. The cabin feels different now, the isolation heavier, as if Elias left a piece of himself behind. Every Christmas, when the snow falls thick and the roads ice over, I listen for footsteps in the drifts, wondering if kin like that ever truly leaves. The mountains hold their secrets tight, you see, and sometimes they send them back, wrapped in flesh and bone, to remind you that some doors, once opened, don't close easy. I've taken to bolting the latch extra tight, but in the quiet hours, I hear it, that murmur from the dark, unraveling what little piece we have left.
Story 3.
Snow dusted the hollows of Tennessee that Christmas Eve, light flakes swirling in the wind like restless spirits, settling on the bare branches of the oaks that ringed our old cabin, making the world outside feel smaller, more confined. The cabin was a sturdy thing, built by my great-grandpap from logs hewed right there in the woods, walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the winter, but not the drafts that whistle through the chinks like faint, eerie calls from the forest. We'd moved up from the valley after Pa lost his job at the mill, seeking solitude in these hills, where the nearest neighbor was a mile down a rutted path that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. Isolation was our companion here, a quiet partner that suited Ma's grieving heart after losing my brother to the fever 2 years back. That night, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke from the stove, mingling with the ham we'd glazed for supper, its salty warmth a brief shield against the encroaching cold. Pa sat whittling by the window, his knife scraping soft against a piece of hickory, while Ma hummed as she cleared the table, her voice a fragile thread in the growing dusk. I was 15 then, old enough to feel the weight of the mountains pressing in. The legends of feral people whispered around campfires, folks who'd gone wild after hard times, surviving in the thickets, their eyes hollow from hunger and madness. Sounds like human voices, but twisted, luring the unwary deeper into the dark. We just pushed back from the table, bellies full but spirits subdued, when the knock came. 3 soft raps, almost apologetic, cutting through the crackle of the fire, like a stone dropped in still water. Pa's knife paused mid-stroke, and Ma's timing faltered, her hands freezing on the dishcloth. Visitors were rare this high up. The road was treacherous even in daylight, slick with frost that hid black ice. I glanced at Pa, but he just nodded toward the door, his face creased with caution. The porch light, a single bulb strung from the eaves, cast a yellow glow into the night as I opened up, letting in a gust that carried the sharp tang of pine and something else, earthy and damp, like turned soil in a graveyard. There stood a man named Harlan, or so he introduced himself, breath barely fogging the air despite the bite. His frame leaned under a coat patched with mismatched fabric, He claimed to be a friend of Pa's from the old mining days, though Pa's eyes narrowed when he said it, swearing later he'd never laid eyes on the fella. Harlan's smile was too wide, teeth glinting unnaturally in the dim light, but hospitality won out. We pulled up a chair at the table's end, offering a plate of ham and cornbread, steam rising lazy into the room. He accepted with a nod, settling in like he'd been there before, his boots leaving faint tracks of mud that smelled of deep woods, places where the sun didn't reach. Right from the start, something nagged at me. The way he held the fork, deliberate but without hunger, picking at the food while his eyes roamed the cabin, lingering on the framed photo of my brother on the shelf, his young face frozen in a grin from better days. The fire popped behind him, flames dancing steady, but a chill seeped in regardless, wrapping around my ankles like creek water in spring. Ma tried to make talk, asking after mutual acquaintances from the mines, but Harlan's answers were vague, names that sounded familiar but didn't quite fit, like pieces from a different puzzle. Pa shifted in his seat, his whittling forgotten, and I felt the first stir of unease, that slow creep of dread that starts in your gut and climbs your spine, the kind of mountains breed in you after too many nights listening to the wind moan like lost souls. As the evening deepened, the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and sending drafts snaking across the floor, making the lantern on the table flicker. We gathered around the table for grace, heads bowed, but Harlan's voice joined in low, a murmur that undercut Pa's steady recitation, words that twisted the familiar prayer to something off-key, pulling at threads of memory I'd buried deep. He spoke of the cavern that scarred Pa's lungs years back, details too precise, the way the timbers groaned before snapping, the dust choking the air like fog in the hollows, whispers of men trapped below who still called out in the dark shafts, names echoing up from the depths. Pa's face went ashen, his hand tightening on the tablecloth. That accident was a family scar, talked about only in hushed tones. And the trapped men, well, some said their voices lingered in the abandoned mines, eerie sounds that mimic kin to draw rescuers into collapses. But Harlan recounted it like he'd been there, his smile widening as he leaned forward, the room growing oppressive, air thick with unspoken dread, like the heavy stillness before a storm. We moved to the sitting area after, the fire stoked high, its warmth fighting the cold that seemed to emanate from Harlan himself. Ma brought out the cider, mulled with spices that filled the cabin with a clove-scented haze. But even that couldn't chase the growing chill. Harlan's plate sat mostly untouched, the ham cooling fast, unnaturally so, as if the heat fled from it. He regaled us with more tales then, yarns from the old days that hit too close, the time the river flooded and took half the town, including kin we'd lost, details of their last moments that no survivor had shared. The cabin's isolation felt sharper now, the woods outside alive with unexplainable sounds. A branch snap here, a rustle there, like something circling just beyond the light. Legends of feral people crept into my mind unbidden, stories from hunters about strange sightings in the underbrush, figures hunched and wild, surviving on scraps, their calls mimicking human speech to lure prey or kin. Pa tried to steer the talk lighter, mentioning the Christmas service we'd attend come morning, but Harlan's gaze drifted to the window, where frost etched patterns like veins on the glass. Later, as the clock ticked toward 10, Harlan cornered me in the kitchen, while Ma and Pa stepped out to the porch for a smoke, the night air crisp, but carrying that damp earth smell stronger now. I was rinsing plates, the water running hot from the tap, when he appeared silent in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the linoleum. "Your brother's fever," he whispered, breath cold against my ear despite the steam. "Wasn't just sickness, was it?" He heard Em calling from the woods that last night, voices like family, drawing him out barefoot into the cold. My hand stilled under the faucet, heart pounding. We'd found my brother wandered off, delirious and chilled to the bone, muttering about calls from the trees, feral echoes, perhaps, or just fever dreams. But we kept that secret, blaming the illness alone, not the pool of the dark forest legends that said the wild ones claimed the weak. Harlan's touch on my shoulder was like ice through my shirt, imparting a vision. No, a memory sharpened. My brother's pale face, lips moving with names of long-dead uncles, eyes hollow as mine shafts. I pulled away, muttering excuses, but the dread had settled heavy, unshakable, like a stone in my chest. Back in the main room, the fire had dimmed, flames guttering low as if starved of oxygen, shadows pooling in the corners unnaturally deep. The house groaned in response to the wind, floorboards creaking like footsteps overhead. Though the attic was empty, Ma returned shivering, Pennsylvania close behind, their faces pinched for more than the cold. We sat uneasy, the conversation faltering, Harlan's presence a weight that bent the air. He confided more then, low voices around the dying fire, dreams that plagued our family, ones I'd never shared aloud, nightmares of being buried alive in the mines, dirt filling my mouth, or lost in the woods with calls that sounded like Ma but led deeper into thorns. The room grew quieter, the ticks of the clock slowing, as if time itself recoiled. Mirrors on the walls fogged subtle, like breath from behind the glass, and I swore I saw movement in the reflections, shapes that didn't match our own. Midnight approached, the witching hour in these hills, where legends said the veil thinned, feral survivors emerging from hiding to whisper at windows. We rose for final toast, cider mugs clinking hollow, but Harlan was already fading toward the door, his coat shrugged on without a sound. "Obliged for the meal," he said, that too wide smile flashing once more. Pa nodded stiff, Ma clutching her shawl, and he stepped out into the snow-dusted night, the door latching behind him. Through the window, his silhouette trudged toward the tree line, but the tracks he left, crisp at first, veered off the path, circling back toward the cabin before vanishing into the underbrush where the feral tails plied their lairs. We bolted the door, the lock clicking loud in the silence, but sleep came hard that night, the wind carrying faint echoes like whispers from the woods. Come dawn, Christmas morning broke clear but cold, the snow a thin blanket over the hollows, gifts exchanged with forced cheer under the branch tree. Harlan was gone, no sign save for a shadow that lingered by his empty chair, unmoving in the morning light until I blinked it away. We've set one less place at the table since, avoiding talk of that night, but the cabin feels marked, the isolation a cage rather than refuge. Every Christmas, that empty chair creaks as if occupied, pulling at the silence with invisible weight, and when the wind rises, I hear those whispers again, calls like kin, drawing me to the window to scan the trees for strange sightings. The mountains guard their secrets well, you see, sending reminders in flesh and bone, fatal or otherwise, to stir the buried dread. I've taken to sleeping with the light on, but the sorrow lingers, confusion wrapping tight, leaving me to wonder if Harlan waits out there still, smile wide, ready to whisper more truths that unravel what little peace we cling to in these lonesome hills.
Story 4.
The fog rolled in thick that Christmas morning in the Blue Ridge, muffling the world outside our trailer like a shroud drawn tight, turning the sharp outlines of pines into soft, ghostly shapes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking straight at them. We'd scraped together what we could for the holiday, a modest tree cut from the edge of the property, strong with lights that flickered from the generator's unsteady hum, and a ham thawing in the sink that Ma had bartered for down in town. The trailer sat perched on a ridge, miles from the paved roads, where the gravel path turned to mud and rain and snowdrifts in winter, isolating us like the mountains intended. Pa had been gone for years, claimed by a logging accident that left his chainsaw buried in the trunk he'd been felling. And since then it was just me and Ma, surviving on her pension checks and what I could hunt or trap in the woods. The air that morning carried a damp chill, seeping through the thin metal walls, and the radio crackled with static-laced carols that sounded distant, like echoes from another valley. I was up early, stoking the wood stove with splits I'd chopped the day before, the axe still leaning by the door, its blade dulled from use. Ma shuffled in her slippers, starting the coffee pot that gurgled like a creek over rocks, her face lined deeper than her years from the weight of solitude. The knock came at dawn, soft but persistent, cutting through the fog's hush like a finger tapping on glass. Ma paused with the percolator in hand, her eyes meeting mine across the cramped kitchen. Folks didn't come calling this early, not up here where the ridges folded in on themselves. Hiding hollows, where old mining camps had crumbled into legend, places said to harbor feral people, survivors of collapses who'd gone wild, living off the land with eyes that gleamed mad in the moonlight. I opened the door cautious, letting in a swirl of mist that tasted of wet earth. And there stood a man with a sack slung over his shoulder. His frame stooped like the weight had bent him over time. He looked up, face weathered as old leather, eyes deep set and trembling at the edges. "Morning, kin," he rasped, voice like gravel shifting underfoot. "I'm your Uncle Ray, your Ma's brother, back from the Wanderer." Ma gasps off behind me, hand to her mouth. She'd spoken of a brother once, lost to some forgotten war. Maybe Nam, maybe Korea. The details blurred in family tales, presumed dead or drifted off. His hand shook as he gripped the sack, fingers knotted and scarred, like he clawed his way back from somewhere deep, perhaps a foxhole or the underbrush where the feral hid. We invited him in, blood being thicker than the fog outside, especially on Christmas when the holy day demanded grace. Ma set an extra place at the fold-out table, eggs and biscuits steaming from the skillet, the yellow yolks pooling like trapped sunlight. Ray eased into the chair that had been Pa's, the vinyl creaking under him, and dropped the sack by his feet with a thud that echoed odd in the small space. Up close, his clothes carried a musty scent, like attic dust mixed with damp soil, and his tremors were constant, subtle shakes that made the fork rattle against the plate. He picked at the food, not really eating, just shifting it around, while his eyes roamed the trailer, lingering on the faded photos tacked to the paneling, images of Pa in his flannel, me as a boy with a stringer of fish, Ma young and smiling before the line set in. "Fine spread," he muttered, but his story started weaving in almost immediate, fretting through our own like vines choking a tree. Details about the flood that took our old family home down in the holler when Ma was a girl. "Water came rushing that night," he said. Fork paused, swallowed the porch whole, then the kitchen. "Your grandpap hollered for the kids, but the current pulled him under. Faces pressed in against the windows like they was begging. Ma's biscuit crumbled in her hand. That flood was a buried wound, the kind we didn't speak of, and the faces, only the drowned could know that. Kin who'd been swept away and never surfaced, bodies tangled in roots miles downstream. I chalked it to old memories resurfacing, but the unease crept in slow, like the fog seeping under the door. The trailer felt smaller with him there, the isolation of the Blue Ridge pressing closer, the woods beyond the windows alive with unseen things, legends of feral people who'd retreated after the mines closed, surviving in caves and tickets. This sounds mimicking kin to draw folks out on lonesome nights. Ray's tremors worsened as he talked, his hands gesturing like they were digging through dirt, unearthing more, tales of feuds that split the family branches, uncles vanishing into the ridges during hunts, rifles found but bodies gone, perhaps claimed by the wild ones. Ma tried to steer the conversation, asking after his travels, but his answers shifted like smoke. First the war, then wandering jobs in the coal fields, details that didn't line up, but hit too close to our own buried history. The coffee cooled quick in my mug, unnaturally so, and I noticed the clock on the wall then, its second hand dragging sluggish, like time itself was thickening in the room. As the morning stretched, the fog didn't burn off like it should, clinging to the windows and muting the light, casting the interior in a perpetual dawn glow. We cleared the breakfast dishes, the clatter echoing hollow, and Ray insisted on opening his sack early, since the day's short up here. The gifts were wrapped in newspaper yellowed with age, pages from editions long past, headlines faded about wars and missing persons that echoed the mountain lore. He handed Ma a tarnished brooch, pins bent like they'd been pried from something, and for me, a pocket watch, heavy brass with a chain that looped cold in my palm. "From the old line," he said, his trembles steadying as he watched me flip it open. The face was scratched, hands frozen at first, but when I wound the stem absent-minded, it ticked to life, backward, the seconds unwinding like thread from a spool. The trailer grew quieter then, the generator's hum fading distant, and shadows pooled in the corners where the weak light should have pierced, dark patches that seemed to deepen, shifting subtle when I turned away. We tried to salvage the holiday spirit, might put on the radio again. Silent night, crackling through, but the melody warped in the air, notes dragging long like the clock. Ray's presence weighed heavier, his stories probing deeper, pulling up roots we'd covered over. He spoke of Pava's accident, The chainsaws whined before it bound, but with whispers Pa had muttered in his last days, about shapes in the woods calling his name, human voices but feral, luring him off the path during that final cut. Isolation clawed at me then, the trailer a tin box adrift in the fog, the ridges hiding secrets like the feral legends, sightings of hunched figures in the undergrowth, surviving on berries and game, eyes reflecting nothing but madness, sounds like family echoes to tempt the lost. I wound the watch again, compulsive, and visions flickered, not dreams, but memories sharpened unnatural. Faces of kin long gone, Grandpa's stern gaze from a photo, but alive, staring accusingly through the glass, lips moving silent with grievances, debts unpaid from old feuds, promises broken in the flood's wake. Ma's face paled as Ray leaned close to her, murmuring about the child she'd lost before me. A miscarriage kept secret, details of the pain that no outsider could know. The day wore on sluggish, the creeping tension building like pressure in a storm front. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the path to the shed, and eerie sounds filtered through. A branch snap here, a rustle like footsteps circling, human but hesitant, perhaps the feral ones drawn by the warmth leaking from our vents. Inside, the shadows deepened, pooling like spilled ink under the table, and the clock stick slowed further, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Ray's tremors passed to the trailer itself, the floor vibrating subtle, like something burrowing beneath. We ate the ham midday, but appetites were thin, the meat tasting ashen, and Ray's plate remained near full, cooling fast as if the life had drained from it. He gifted more from the sack, a faded quilt for Ma, patches from clothes of the dead, smelling of river mud, and as she unfolded it, her hands shook, recognizing patterns from the flood-lost home. The visions came stronger when I wound the watch again, kin staring from graves unrest, accusing eyes pulling at sorrows I'd buried, my own guilt over not being there for Pa, the pull of the woods that tempted me on hunts, whispers like family calling me deeper. Night fell early, the fog ushering in dusk before the clock, still dragging, hit 3. The generator sputtered, lights dimmed to a glow, casting Ray's face in angles that shifted unnerving, his smile too fixed. We gathered by the stove for warmth, but the chill emanated from him, seeping like mist from a creek. His stories turned inward, confiding debts the family owed, to the land, to the lost, echoes of feuds that lingered in the ridges, feral descendants perhaps, surviving as reminders. The trailer groaned, walls creaking like old joints, and outside, the sounds grew bolder, faint calls like names from memory, drawing near then fading. I clutched the watch, its backward tick vibrating in my palm, visions overwhelming, drowned faces pressing, accusing, debts like chains pulling me under. Ma retired to her room, door clicking shut, leaving me with Ray in the dim, his form blurring as the fire banked low. He leaned close then, breath cold as fog. The mountains collect what's due, boy. Echoes come back to remind. His tremor touched my arm, visions peaking, graves opening, kin rising pharaoh from the wild, eyes hollow calling. Night deepened, the fog a blanket smothering sound, and when I dozed fitful in the chair, Ray faded with it. No farewell, just an empty seat come the weak dawn light. The sack gone, only echoes in the walls, a faint rasp like his voice lingering in the quiet spaces. The fog lifted slow that next day. Christmas passed in hollow ritual, gifts exchanged but joy absent. I've hidden that watch deep in the shed, buried under tools rusted from disuse. But on Christmas, its faint ticking returns, seeping from the wood like a heartbeat, reminding me of debts unpaid and graves unrest. The trailer feels haunted by absence, the isolation of veil thinner now, with legends stirring in the ridges, feral calls on the wind, strange sightings in the fog. Every year, I listen for that knock at dawn, confusion and sorrow twisting tight, wondering if echoes like Ray ever truly fade, or if they wait in the wild, clawing back to collect what's owed in these unforgiving hills.
Story 5.
I remember that Christmas Eve like it was etched into the bark of the old hickory tree out back, the one that stood sentinel over our hollow since before Paula was born. The snow had started falling just after dusk, light and powdery at first, dusting the ridges of the Tennessee mountains like sugar on a forgotten cake. Our cabin sat tucked deep in the hollow, miles from the nearest neighbor, the kind of place where the wind whispers through the pines and carries secrets you'd rather not hear. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke from the stove, mingling with the salty tang of the ham Ma had been glazing all afternoon. It was one of those hams from the smokehouse, cured slow over hickory chips, the kind that fills the whole house with a warmth that pushes back against the cold creeping in from the forest. We were a small bunch that year, just me, Pa, Ma, and my little sister Ellie, who was barely 10 and still believed in the magic of the season. Pa had come in from chopping firewood, his boots leaving muddy prints on the worn floorboards, his breath huffing out in clouds even inside. He'd been coughing more lately, that deep, rattling hat from the mines that never quite left him after the cavern back in '92. Ma fussed over him, wrapping a quilt around his shoulders as he settled by the fire. Ellie was stringing popcorn on thread for the tree, her fingers sticky and quick, giggling at nothing in particular. I was 23 then, home from the mill for the holidays, feeling that pull between the life I'd left behind in the holler and the one I was chasing in town. The radio crackled faintly in the corner, playing old carols that skipped every now and then, like the needle was remembering ghosts of its own. The knock came just as Ma was pulling the ham from the oven, the sound sharp and insistent against the quiet hum of the evening. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor, it was urgent, like someone who'd been wandering too long in the cold. Pa glanced up from his chair, his brow furrowing under the brim of his cap. "Who in carnation could that be?" he muttered, setting down his pipe. The hollow was isolated, the road up from the valley treacherous in snow, and folks didn't just drop by unannounced, especially on Christmas Eve. I went to the door, peering through the frostlace glass. There he was, a man tall and gaunt, his coat dusted white, breath fogging the pane as he leaned in close. His eyes caught the lantern light, dark and steady, like pools of ink in the night. I cracked the door, letting in a gust of icy wind that made the candles on the table flicker. "Evening," I said, trying to sound welcoming but feeling that first prick of unease. He smiled then, a wide stretch of lips that showed too many teeth, glinting unnaturally in the dim light, like they'd been polished by something other than life. "Name's Harlan," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying that mountain drawl, but with an edge I couldn't place. "Friend of your pa's from the mines. Been a spell, but I was passing through and thought I'd pay my respects." Pa shuffled over, peering past my shoulder, his face paling a bit in the firelight. "Don't reckon I know a Harlan," he said, but there was a hesitation in his words, like he was sifting through memories buried deep. Ma, ever the hospitable one, clucked her tongue. "Well, don't leave the man standing in the snow. Come on in, warm yourself. Supper's just about ready." Harlan stepped inside, shaking the snow from his boots with a deliberate slowness, his eyes sweeping the room like he was cataloging every shadow. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, revealing a frame lean as a winter branch, clothes worn but clean, like they'd been mended 100 times. We pulled up an extra chair at the table, the old wooden one from the attic that creaked under even Ellie's weight. As we settled in, the air seemed to thicken, the warmth from the stove dimming just a touch. Harlan nodded thanks as Ma served him a plate, the ham steaming and juicy, flanked by collards and cornbread, but I noticed right away how his portion seemed to cool faster than the rest, the steam vanishing almost instantly, like the heat was being sucked right out of it. Conversation started light, the way it does with strangers in these parts, talk of the weather, the roads, how the mines were faring up north. Harlan listened more than he spoke at first, his smile never quite fading, those teeth catching the candlelight in a way that made my skin crawl. Ellie stared at him wide-eyed, too young to sense the offness, but Pa kept glancing my way, his fork hovering over his plate. Then Harlan leaned back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and started spinning yarns. "You remember that cave-in, don't you, Jed?" he said to Pa, using his name like an old buddy. "The one where the timbers gave way like brittle bones. I was there, pulling shifts with you boys. Heard the screams echoing down them shafts, men calling out from the dark." Pa's face went ashen, his cough catching in his throat. "That was years ago," he roused, setting down his utensils. Lost good friends that day. Don't much like dwelling on it. But Harlan pressed on, his voice dropping to a murmur that filled the room like smoke. He recounted details Pa had only shared in hushed tones late at night. The way the earth groaned before it collapsed, the dust choking the air, the faint cries from the trapped souls below that haunted the rescuers. Things Pa swore he'd never told a soul outside the family. Ma tried to steer the talk elsewhere, asking about Harlan's kin, but he waved it off with that grin, his eyes locking on each of us in turn. The candles guttered low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, and I felt a chill seep in, not from the door or the windows, but from him, like mist rising from a cold creek bed. As the meal wore on, I watched Harlan's plate. He poked at the food, lifting bites to his mouth, but it never seemed to diminish, the ham staying pink and untouched, cooling to a gray pallor. Ellie whispered to me under her breath, "He ain't eaten much, is he?" I shushed her, but my own appetite had fled. The room felt smaller, the fire crackling less heartily, as if the warmth was being drawn away. Harlan turned to me then, his gaze piercing. "You work at the mill now, boy. Bet the machines hum like the old pumps in the mine, sucking the life out of the ground." I nodded uneasy, and he chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over gravel. "Heard tell of accidents there, too. Limbs caught, blood on the saws. Keeps you up at night, don't it?" We cleared the table slow, the clink of dishes echoing in the heavy silence. Mo busied herself in the kitchen, humming a carol to chase away the gloom, but even her voice sounded thin. Pa excused himself to stoke the fire, his steps heavier than usual, and Ellie clung to my side, her small hand cold in mine. Harlan lingered at the table, nursing a cup of coffee that steamed for everyone else, but went flat and cool in his grasp. As the clock ticked toward midnight, he motioned me closer, his voice a whisper meant only for my ears. "Come sit a spell, son. I got something to tell ya." I hesitated, but curiosity, or maybe that mountain stubbornness, pulled me into the chair beside him. The parlor was dim, lit only by the dying embers and a single lantern, the shadows pooling in the corners like forgotten water. Harlan leaned in, his breath carrying no warmth, no scent of the meal we'd shared. "You dream, don't you? Dreams that clamp down like the earth itself." My heart stuttered. How could he know? Those nightmares I kept buried since I was a kid. The ones where the ground swallowed me whole, dirt filling my mouth, lungs burning as I clawed at nothing. I'd be gasping, sheets tangled, but I'd never breathed a word. Not to Pa, not to anyone. They started after Pa's accident, when he'd come home hollow-eyed, coughing black dust. "Buried alive," Harlan murmured, his eyes gleaming. "That's what it feels like, ain't it? The weight pressing down, the voices calling from below. Your pa hears them too, in his sleep. And little Ellie, she sees shapes in the woods, don't she? Feral folk, they call them up here. Lost souls wandering the ridges, eyes glowing in the dark." I pulled back, a shiver racing down my spine. The cabin creaked around us, the wind howling through the eaves like distant wails. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. But Harlan just smiled wider, those teeth flashing. "Just a friend passing through. Mountains got long memories, boy. They remember the men they took, the secrets they keep." Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the world in white silence, the forest pressing close against the windows like it was listening. Ma called us for midnight prayers, her voice trembling just a bit. We gathered in the parlor, kneeling on the rag rug, heads bowed as Pa recited the old words, his voice rough but steady. Ellie clustered all, eyes squeezed shut. I glanced up once, and Harlan was there, kneeling with us, but his lips moved without sound, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards, darker than the rest. When Pa said amen, we rose, the air heavy with unspoken dread. But Harlan was gone. No coat on the peg, no boots by the door, no tracks in the fresh snow outside when I checked. Just the empty chair at the table, and by it, a shadow that didn't move with the firelight, lingering like a stain. That night, sleep came fitful, the cabin groaning under the weight of the snow, the wind carrying faint echoes that sounded like calls from deep underground. I dreamed again, worse than before, the earth closing in. But this time, Harlan's face in the dark, grinning as the dirt filled my eyes. Come morning, Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off the icicles like knives. We opened gifts by the tree, but the joy was muted, Ellie's laughter forced. Pat didn't speak of the night before, but I saw him staring at that chair, his cough deeper, like something had settled in his chest. Years have passed since that eve, but the hollow feels different now, more isolated, the forest legends whispering louder in the night. We've set one less place at the table every Christmas, but that empty chair creaks as if occupied, pulling at the silence like an unseen hand. Sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the fire burns low, I swear I hear that gravelly voice spinning yarns from the shadows, recounting dreams I still can't shake. Pa's gone now, taken by the lungs the mind scarred, and Ellie moved away, but she writes of nightmares that follow her. Me, I stay in the cabin, listening to the wind, wondering if Harlan was ever real or are just a mountain's way of reminding us we're all just one cave in away from the dark. The shadow lingers, you see, not just by the chair, but in the quiet moments, a chill that seeps in like mist from the creek, leaving me to wonder who's really pulling up a seat at the feast.
Story 6.
I still can't shake that Christmas, the one back in '98 when the snow came down so hard it felt like the mountains themselves were trying to bury us alive. Our cabin sat high up in the Virginia highlands, tucked into a narrow draw where the pines grew thick and the wind funneled straight through like it had a grudge. It was just me, Mama, and Granddaddy that year. Daddy had passed the winter before from the black lung, and my brother was off in the army, somewhere warmer than here. The place was old, logs chinked with moss and mud that never quite kept the cold out, and every gust rattled the tin roof like bones in a box. We'd been burning hickory all day to keep the chill off, the smoke hanging low in the holler, mixing with the sharp bite of snow in the air. Mama was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for biscuits, her hands red from the cold water. Granddaddy sat by the hearth in his rocker, whittling a little cedar horse for the mantel, his knife scraping slow and steady. I was 19 then, home from a community college down in Roanoke for the break, feeling that strange pull of the mountains, half wanting to stay forever, half scared they'd never let me leave. We dragged in a small freezer for the day before, its needles already dropping from the dry heat inside, and I was stringing the old glass ornaments and the strands of colored lights that flickered more than they glowed. The radio played faint carols from a station out of Bristol. Cutting in and out was static whenever the wind shifted. The knock came soft at first, almost lost under the howl outside, but then it came again, 3 deliberate taps, like someone who knew we were in here and wasn't leaving till we answered. Granddaddy lifted his head, eyes narrowing under his bushy brows. "Ain't nobody coming up this road tonight," he muttered. The snow was already knee-deep. The trail down to the county road drifted shut. I went to the window first, wiping a circle in the frost, and there she was, a girl about my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself. Her coat was thin, threadbare wool that looked like it had seen better decades, and her dark hair was crusted with ice. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding where they showed, like she'd been clawing through brush for miles. I opened the door just a crack, letting in a blast of wind that snatched the warmth right out of the room. "You lost?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She looked up at me, eyes wide and dark, almost black in the lantern light, and something in them made my stomach twist. "I'm kin," she said, her words rasping like she hadn't used her voice in days. "Way back, through your grandmama's people, the ones from over near Clinch Mountain. Name's Cora." Granddaddy stood up slow, leaning on his cane, peering past me. He didn't say he knew her, didn't say he didn't, just stared for a long moment, then nodded once. "Can't leave blood on the porch in this weather," he said finally. Mama called from the kitchen. "Bring her in, child, before we all freeze." We thawed her by the hearth, wrapping her in Granddaddy's old army blanket and setting a mug of coffee in her hands. Her fingers were so cold the heat didn't seem to touch them. The mug stayed cool long after it should have warmed. She didn't shiver, not really, just sat there staring into the flames, her breath barely fogging the air. As we went back to trimming the tree, she started talking, quiet at first, like she was testing the words. Stories about winters long past, blizzards that came sudden and fierce, trapping folks in their homes till spring. She spoke of an aunt lost in '63, wandering out for firewood and never found till the thaw, frozen solid by the creek. Then an uncle in the big 177, caught out hunting when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a night, his body discovered months later with his rifle still clutched in blackened hands. Mama's hands slowed on the dough. Those were our people she would... Though the door was shut tight and the windows latched, the ornaments on the tree began to clink softly against each other, a faint tinkling with no breeze to move them. Cora's eyes darted around the room, quick and wary, like a deer sensing a hunter just out of sight. "These mountains keep what they take," she murmured, almost to herself. "Don't never let go easy." We fed her supper, venison stew thick with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, cornbread still warm from the oven. She ate slow, picking at it more than anything, but thank Mama polite enough. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows that seemed to linger too long on the walls. Every so often, a cold breath would snake across the back of my neck, raising the hairs there, even though I was sitting closest to the hearth. Granddaddy kept watching her, his eyes sharp under the brim of his cap, like he was trying to place a memory that wouldn't quite surface. Outside, the wind kept up its moaning, driving snow against the panes until the glass frosted over completely. I still can't shake that Christmas, the one back in '98 when the snow came down so hard it felt like the mountains themselves were trying to bury us alive. Our cabin sat high up in the Virginia highlands, tucked into a narrow draw where the pines grew thick and the wind funneled straight through like it had a grudge. It was just me, Mama, and Granddaddy that year. Daddy had passed the winter before from the black lung, and my brother was off in the army, somewhere warmer than here. The place was old, logs chinked with moss and mud that never quite kept the cold out, and every gust rattled the tin roof like bones in a box. We'd been burning hickory all day to keep the chill off, the smoke hanging low in the holler, mixing with the sharp bite of snow in the air. Mama was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for biscuits, her hands red from the cold water. Granddaddy sat by the hearth in his rocker, whittling a little cedar horse for the mantel, his knife scraping slow and steady. I was 19 then, home from a community college down in Roanoke for the break, feeling that strange pull of the mountains, half wanting to stay forever, half scared they'd never let me leave. We dragged in a small freezer for the day before, its needles already dropping from the dry heat inside, and I was stringing the old glass ornaments and the strands of colored lights that flickered more than they glowed. The radio played faint carols from a station out of Bristol, cutting in and out with static whenever the wind shifted. The knock came soft at first, almost lost under the howl outside, but then it came again, free deliberate taps, like someone who knew we were in here and wasn't leaving till we answered. Granddaddy lifted his head, eyes narrowing under his bushy brows. "Ain't nobody coming up this road tonight," he muttered. The snow was already knee-deep. The trail down to the county road drifted shut. I went to the window first, wiping a circle in the frost, and there she was, a girl about my age, maybe a year or two younger, standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself. Her coat was thin, threadbare wool that looked like it had seen better decades, and her dark hair was crusted with ice. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding where they showed, like she'd been clawing through brush for miles. I opened the door just a crack, letting in a blast of wind that snatched the warmth right out of the room. "You lost?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She looked up at me, eyes wide and dark, almost black in the lantern light, and something in them made my stomach twist. "I'm kin," she said, her words rasping like she hadn't used her voice in days. "Way back, through your grandmom's people, the ones from over near Clinch Mountain. Name's Cora." Granddaddy stood up slow, leaning on his cane, peering past me. He didn't say he knew her, didn't say he didn't, just stared for a long moment, then nodded once. "Can't leave blood on the porch in this weather," he said finally. Mama called from the kitchen. "Bring her in, child, before we all freeze." We thawed her by the hearth, wrapping her in Granddaddy's old army blanket and setting a mug of coffee in her hands. Her fingers were so cold the heat didn't seem to touch them. The mug stayed cool long after it should have warmed. She didn't shiver, not really, just sat there staring into the flames, her breath barely fogging the air. As we went back to trimming the tree, she started talking, quiet at first, like she was testing the words. Stories about winters long past, blizzards that came sudden and fierce, trapping folks in their homes till spring. She spoke of an aunt lost in '63, wandering out for firewood and never found till the thaw, frozen solid by the creek. Then an uncle in the big one of '77, caught out hunting when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in the night, his body discovered months later with his rifle still clutched in blackened hands. Mama's hand slowed on the dough. Those were our people she was naming, family we'd mourned in silence, stories told only in whispers because the pain was still raw. Granddaddy's whittling knife stopped moving altogether. I felt the air shift, like a draft had found a new crack, though the door was shut tight and the windows latched. The ornaments on the tree began to clink softly against each other, a faint tinkling with no breeze to move them. Cora's eyes darted around the room, quick and wary, like a deer sensing a hunter just out of sight. "These mountains keep what they take," she murmured, almost to herself. "Don't never let go easy." We fed her supper, venison stew thick with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, cornbread still warm from the oven. She ate slow, picking at it more than anything, but thank Mama polite enough. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows that seemed to linger too long on the walls. Every so often, a cold breath would snake across the back of my neck, raising the hairs there, even though I was sitting closest to the hearth. Granddaddy kept watching her, his eyes sharp under the brim of his cap, like he was trying to place a memory that wouldn't quite surface. Outside, the wind kept up its moaning, driving snow against the panes until the glass frosted over completely.
Story 7.
That Christmas of 2001 still sits heavy on me, like damp clay packed around the chest. We were up in the North Georgia mountains, in the little cedar-shingled house my granddaddy built back when the timber companies were still chewing through the ridges. The place was set far back on a dirt track that turned to mud 9 months out of the year and froze solid the other 3. That December the cold came early and mean, snapping branches in the night and hanging icicles off the eaves so long they looked like they could spear a man clean through if he stood underneath too long. Me and my wife Clara had come up from Atlanta with our 2 boys, Jacob 12 and little Amos 7, to spend a holiday with my sister Ruth and her husband Dale. It was supposed to be a mending year. Too many harsh words had passed between us all after Mama died the winter before, and we figured the mountains might quiet things down some. The house smelled of cedar smoke, and the ham Clara had slow baked with brown sugar and cloves. Ruth had strung lights along the porch rails, the colored bulbs glowing soft against the snow that dusted the ground like salt spilled on dark wood. We'd hung mistletoe over the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room, fresh cut from the woods out back, green and waxy with those pale berries that looked almost like tiny eyes. The boys were excited, running in and out with their boots on, tracking meltwater across the pine floors. Dale had the radio tuned low to a station playing old hymns mixed with carols, and every now and then the signal would fade and come back with a hiss, like something breathing through the wires. The knock came just as the sun dropped behind a ridge, leaving the sky the color of a fresh bruise. It wasn't loud, just 3 measured raps, patient, like whoever was out there knew we'd hear it eventually. Dale went to the door, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and when he pulled it open the cold rolled and so sharp it stung the eyes. There stood a woman none of us had seen in years, Cousin Lila, or so she said. She looked like the old photographs of her, but worn thin, cheeks hollow, dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. She had a battered suitcase in one hand and a smile that didn't quite fit right, too wide and brittle, like thin ice about to crack. "Merry Christmas, kin," she said, voice light but edged with something rough underneath. Figured it was time to come home. Ruth froze in the kitchen doorway, flour still on her apron. Lila was Mama's sister's girl, raised over in Rabbit County till her mama ran off, and her daddy drank himself under. Last we'd heard she'd gone north, maybe Carolina, maybe farther. Nobody had laid eyes on her since the funeral, and even then she'd kept to the back of the church, slipping out before the graveside. But there she was, hugging Ruth's stiff arm, then Clara, then me, her embrace tight and cold, smelling of wet earth and pine needles left too long in water. The boys stared wide-eyed as she ruffled their hair, calling them by name, though she'd never met Amos, and Jacob had been knee-high last she might have seen him. We brought her in, of course. Mountain ways don't let you turn blood away on a night that cold, no matter the history. She set her suitcase by the hearth and warmed her hands, though they never seemed to pick up the way yours or mine would. Clara poured her coffee, Dale offered bourbon, and we all settled into that awkward dance of catching up when too much is gone unsaid. Lila laughed at the right times, but the sound was brittle, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. She asked after folks who'd passed, spoke of others like she'd seen them yesterday, and every now and then her eyes would linger too long on one of us, as if measuring something only she could see. As the evening wore on, we gathered in the sitting room, the fire popping and hissing, the colored lights on the little tabletop tree blinking slow. Someone had hung more mistletoe above the archway, and the boys kept daring each other to run under it. Lila stood there a long while, staring up at the sprigs, fingers brushing the leaves like she was reading something written in them. Then she started talking, quiet at first, stories about family gatherings from years back, Thanksgivings and baptisms and weddings. But the details she gave were too sharp, too private. She spoke of the fight Ruth and I had after Mama's was red, how I had accused Ruth of hiding the good silver, words I regretted the minute they left my mouth. She mentioned Dale's gambling down in Dalton, money borrowed from men who didn't take kindly to waiting, things Clara had only found out about last spring. She said it gentle, almost kind, like she was smoothing old wounds. But every word landed heavy, stirring up silt we'd all tried to let settle. The lights began to dim and brighten without reason, the way they do when the generator stutters. But Dale swore it was running steady. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and Lila's face would shift in the flicker, cheekbones sharper one moment, eyes deeper set the next, like the firelight couldn't decide what she looked like. When she reached for my hand to pull me under the mistletoe for a cousinly kiss, her skin was so cold it burned. The moment her fingers closed around mine, pictures came unbidden. Me walking away from Ruth's door that day after the funeral, the slam echoing behind me. Clara crying alone in our kitchen over bills she thought I didn't know about. Dale staring at his cards in some dim basement room, sweat beading though the air was cool. Paths we'd taken, regrets branching like roots under dark soil. I pulled away quick, muttering excuse, and went to check on the boys. Later, during the gift exchange, we sat in a circle on the rag rugs, paper tearing and laughter forced bright to cover the strain. Lila had brought nothing wrapped, but she gave each of us something anyway, words mostly. To Ruth she spoke of forgiveness long overdue, to Clara of burdens shared in silence, to the boys of growing up strong in these mountains. Her voice stayed soft, almost loving, but the house seemed to answer it. Floorboards groaned though no weight shifted. The wind outside picked up though the trees had been still, and the mistletoe above us began to droop, leaves curling at the edges like they'd been touched by frost inside the warm room. When we finally banked the fire and said goodnights, Lila claimed the little back bedroom that used to be mine when I was a boy. I lay awake beside Clara, listening to the house settle, or try to. Somewhere past midnight I heard footsteps, soft, bare soles on pine boards, moving from that back room toward the sitting room and stopping under the archway. A low murmur followed, words too faint to catch, like someone talking to an old friend long absent. Clara slept on, breathing steady, but I couldn't close my eyes. The air in our room grew colder, breath fogging though the fire still glowed down the hall. Come morning, Lila was gone. The back bedroom empty, bed smooth as if never slept in, suitcase vanished. No tracks in the light, snow that had fallen overnight, no sign she'd opened the door at all. Ruth found the mistletoe on the floor, fallen in a heap, every leaf turned black and brittle, berries shriveled like tiny dried hearts. We burned it in the stove without speaking, watching the smoke curl up the chimney thick and gray. We packed up early and drove down the mountain quiet, the boys sensing enough to stay still in the back seat. I haven't gone back for Christmas since. Always some excuse about work or the weather. Ruth and Dale sold the place a few years later, said it felt too empty. But every year, when the cold snaps and the wind moves through the pines down here in the lower country where I live now, I hear it. That brittle laugh carried on a gust, light and inviting, calling from somewhere just out of sight. Sometimes it sounds like it's right outside the window, urging me toward the door, toward reconciliation with things better left unrest. I keep the curtains drawn tight and the lights burning bright, but I know the mountains remember every rift, every cold word, and sometimes they send someone, or something, to gather the pieces back together under the mistletoe.
Story 8.
That Christmas Eve in '04 still clings to me like pine sap. You can't wash off no matter how hard you scrub. We were holed up in the old family place deep in the North Carolina backwoods, up where the Blue Ridge gets sharp and unforgiving, the kind of holler where the dirt road peters out into nothing and the nearest town is 20 miles of Swissbacks away. Snow had been falling steady since morning, heavy wet flakes that piled against the shed and the porch rails till you couldn't tell where the ground ended and the drifts began. The moon hung low and full, turning everything a cold, sickly blue, like lights shining through thin ice. It was just me, my wife Sarah, our daughter Hannah, who was 14 then and full of that restless teenage fire, and my mama, who'd come to stay after Daddy passed the year before. We kept the old traditions going best we could. A ham in the oven, cornbread dressing, a little cedar tree we'd cut ourselves from the ridge behind the house. The fire was roaring in the stone hearth, throwing orange light across the log walls and the braided rugs Mama had made decades ago. Sarah had strung popcorn and cranberries on thread, and Hannah was fiddling with the ancient string of lights that blinked slow and tired, the way they always had. We'd had a few carolers earlier, kids from the church down in the valley who'd braved the road in a four-wheel drive, but they'd headed back before full dark, their voices fading into the wind as they disappeared down the track. After that it was just us, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional groan of the house settling under the weight of the snow. The quiet out here gets deep in winter, the kind that presses in on you till your own heartbeat sounds loud. The night came around 9, maybe 10, 3 hard raps that cut through the hush like a rifle shot. Sarah looked up from her knitting, needles pausing mid-stitch. Mama's rocker slowed. Hannah went to the window first, wiping frost from the pane with her sleeve. "There's somebody out there," she whispered, like saying it louder might make him vanish. I grabbed the lantern off the hook and went to the door, boots crunching on the salt weed scattered earlier. When I opened it, the cold hit like a slap, and there he stood, a man tall and raw-boned, coat crusted with snow, a wool scarf pulled high around his chin. His eyes caught the lantern light, dark and steady, and he smiled wide, too wide, teeth shining white against the shadowed face. "Evening," he said, voice smooth but carrying that mountain drawl worn thin at the edges. "Name's Thorne, kin by marriage way back. Your wife's mama's side, I reckon. Roads drifted shut down the way, and I saw your light from the ridge. Didn't mean to intrude on Christmas, but I'd be obliged for a place by the fire till morning." Sarah's mama had passed when Hannah was small, and we'd lost touch with most of that side of the family years ago. I glanced back at Sarah. She shrugged uncertain, but Mama nodded slow. "You don't turn folks away in weather like this, not up here. Blood or not, stranger or not, the mountains have rules older than any of us." I stepped aside and let him in. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, snow sliding off in wet clumps that melted quick on the floorboards. Underneath he was dressed plain, flannel shirt, dark trousers worn soft at the knees, but something about the way he moved felt off, deliberate, like every step was measured. We offered him coffee and a slice of the pecan pie Sarah had baked that afternoon. He took both with thanks, settling into Daddy's old chair by the hearth, the one nobody sat in much anymore. As he ate, he started talking, easy and familiar, about the roads being worse than he'd seen in years, about how the hollows fill up fast when the snow sets in. Then he turned the talk to family, gentle at first, asking after folks by name. Sarah's Uncle Ray, who'd froze on the trail back in '89, her cousin Marlene, who'd wandered off one night and was never found, Things we didn't speak of often, losses we carried quiet. The room grew heavier as he spoke, the air thick like before a thunderstorm, even though the snow kept falling silent outside. He told the stories better than we ever had, amplifying the grief we tucked away, making the pain feel fresh again. Mama's hands trembled on her lap. Sarah kept glancing at the windows like she expected to see faces in the frost. Hannah sat cross-legged on the rug, staring at Thorn with that mix of curiosity and unease kids get when they sense something adults won't name. The mirrors on the far wall, there's an old one above the mantel and another by the hall, began to fog, slow at first, then thicker, as if someone were breathing on them from the other side. I wiped one with my sleeve and it cleared for a moment, but the cloud came back quicker, like the glass was holding its breath. After pie, we gathered around the tree for the small gifts we'd wrapped, nothing fancy. Handmade things mostly. A carved whistle for Hannah, a scarf Sarah had knit for Mama. Thorn watched quiet, that smile never leaving his face, stretching wider every time one of us laughed or teared up. The lights on the tree flickered more than usual, dimming and surging for no reason we could name. When the others stepped into the kitchen to clean up, he motioned me closer, voice low. "Come sit a minute, son. These hills get lonely, don't they?" I sat uneasy, the fire popping between us. He leaned in, eyes fixed on mine, and that smile spread till it hurt to look at. Too many teeth, too bright. "You feel it too," he murmured. "The pull of the dark woods out there. Nights when the wind sounds like voices calling your name, urging you to walk just a little farther. See what's over the next ridge. Isolation settles in the bones up here, makes a body wonder if anyone would notice if you just kept going." My throat tightened. I'd felt it since I was a boy. Those moments staring out the window into the black pines, a strange ache to step off the porch and not come back. I'd never told Sarah, never told anyone, but here he was laying it bare like he'd lived inside my head. His hand brushed mine on the armrest, cold as creek water in January, and for the second I saw flashes, me years from now, alone in this house, snowed in with no one answering when I called their names. Hannah grown and gone, Sarah's chair empty, the woods swallowing the path till even the cabin faded from memory. I jerked away, muttering something about checking the fire, hard hammering. When I looked back, he was just sitting there, smiling still, like nothing had passed between us. The women came back with cocoa, and we sang a few carols half-hearted, voices thin in the heavy air. Thorn joined in, his baritone strong and sure, but every note seemed to echo a little too long. We turned in early, the guest room made up with fresh sheets, though he insisted he'd take the couch by the hearth. I lay awake beside Sarah, listening to the house creak and the wind moan through the eaves. Somewhere in the dark hours I heard movement, soft footsteps crossing the floor, pausing by the tree, then nothing. Morning came gray and slow, the snow still drifting down in fat flakes. Thorn was gone, the couch blanket folded neat, no indentation in the cushions, no wet prints by the door. Outside, the drifts were smooth and untouched all the way to the tree-lean. But Daddy's chair by the hearth said askew, pulled out at an angle nobody would leave it. And under the tree, one gift we hadn't wrapped, a small box tied with twine, sat opened, paper torn away to reveal nothing inside. Empty, like whatever had been there had slipped out in the night. We didn't speak of him much after that. Mama took to covering the mirrors when the light was low, saying it was just dust. Sarah started leaving earlier in the fall, taking Hannah to her sister's in Asheville till spring. I stayed on, keeping the place up, telling myself it was duty. But every Christmas since, when the snow piles high and the moon turns the woods that pallid blue, I catch it, a glimpse in the mirrors, a smile too wide reflecting back when I'm alone by the tree. Sometimes the chair shifts just enough to creak, or a gift appears under the branches, wrapped neat and waiting. I don't open them anymore. I just sit vigil, fire burning low, listening for that knock that never quite comes, wondering what name he'll use next time, and whether the door will open from the inside.